Good morning and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 69th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Brenda Brook and I'm chair of the Book Fair Steering Committee. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on this Thursday morning to hear about the novel Yiftah by Michael Fertik. The goal of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is to bring the latest new Jewish books and authors from around the world to Metro Detroit. And this year, the rooms we're sitting in may be different, but that purpose remains the same. Our book fair runs through December 9th, and we've got an exceptional lineup of events planned. To see our full event schedule and learn ways to support book fair, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can find a link to purchase Yiftah and plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts, visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/book-fair. This year, in order to provide as much programming to the community as possible, we've made all of our events free of charge. So if you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to book fair. You can do this at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/book-fair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible. So thank you in advance for becoming part of our family. We have a really special event for you this morning, and we want you to be part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below, or by texting to the number in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they'll take as many of your questions as they can. And while you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. The focus of today's event is the novel Yiftah. We have with us the author of the book, Michael Fertik, as well as Yiftah Leket, who will moderate the discussion. Yiftah is the story of Oscar Orleans, a Hebrew-speaking Congolese refugee in Tel Aviv and liaison to the African refugee community there. His old friend, Inspector Kobe Sambinski, calls him on a Shabbat morning, and Oscar knows something's wrong. A young Sudanese immigrant has been found murdered. Together, they venture into the heart of Tel Aviv's Sudanese community to solve this murder. Michael Fertik is a prolific writer of fiction, poetry, films, and plays, for which he's won many prizes, and he's had a New York Times bestseller. Yiftah Leket joined the Detroit Jewish community this past summer. He represents Israel and Israeli culture here as the Shaliach to the Detroit metro area. Please join me in welcoming Michael Fertik and Yiftah Leket. And he's had a New York Times bestseller. Yiftah Leket joined the Detroit Jewish community this past summer. He represents Israel and Israeli culture here as the Shaliach.
Is there a background sound?
Please join me in welcoming Michael.
Yes, I'm getting the audio on delay as well. The audio twice, yes, but I think that the viewers are not.
Okay.
This past
So David, we have like a back. We will continue.
I think now it's gone.
Okay, thank you very much. So good morning.
Thank you, Brenda, for that terrific introduction.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And in this beautiful morning here from Detroit, I want to say I'm very happy to be here with you today. It's exciting for me on a couple of ways. First, because it's kind of my first wide community event that I'm taking part in. Second, because a lot of the things you work on, Michael, on the book, and not only on the book, are kind of my passion, interest areas, and that's exciting as well. But mostly because we're gonna talk about your book, which takes place in my backyard in the last 15 or maybe even 20 years, the city of Tel Aviv, the streets of Tel Aviv. And just before we go into your book, can you tell us a little bit about your background, and mostly about how writing fits inside your professional background? It's kind of an off I don't know, where the puzzle meets between your personal life and your professional life in writing.
Sure, I'll tell you. I'll start by telling you something about myself. So I am Michael Fertik. I'm 42. I live in Palo Alto. I'm here in Palo Alto right now. I am married, and we have 2 kids, 9 and 7. My day job is in tech, right? So I started some companies that have become well known, and have also started investing as Heroic Ventures, which is a venture fund in the last few years. And what I do is I specialize in investing in Silicon Valley companies and in Israeli companies and startups. My family's history with Israel is pretty significant. We have a long family history. Beginning with, I think, basically my father's professional involvement in Israel, not too long after he started working. And my brother served in the IDF. I was bar mitzvahed in Caesarea. And I spend a lot of time in Israel. I go there with frequency, not this year due to the pandemic and so forth. In terms of the connection between this novel, Hipset, and my job as a technologist, there is not a lot. Writing is and has been for me a different part of my life. It's a different magisterium. It's a different part of my life. And I've been publishing in journals of shadow and light, literary journals, for a while. This is, I guess, my first real major novel. And I have done nonfiction writing that is related to theories of privacy or theories of technology, that is related to my work, but not my fiction. I think there's a different part of my life.
But is there any connection to the things because you do a lot of things, yeah, and writing? Can you find any connection to one of those things you do as an entrepreneur, or the way of expression, even like an artistic way?
Well, to be sure, this book is a connection to Israel. So first of all, it's a very Zionist book, right? But I'll show you something. This is the book. And then for those of you who have not seen the internal, we have this sort of secret gift for all the Zionists in the room, which is the cloth cover is this Magen David, which is, I think, so pretty, on the hard cloth cover underneath the dust jacket. And the book takes place in Israel. I have a great interest in Israel, great passion for Israel. And I started writing the book while I was in Israel. So I was actually at a place called La Mer Beach Bar, which you guys may know, which is on the Tayelet in Tel Aviv, and it's one of the great beach bars of Tel Aviv. And this awful jet lag that you get from sort of pretty much anywhere in the U.S. when you go to Israel, but especially from the West Coast. And my habit has been to go get super early morning cafe Americanos with your toes in the sand, because these places are open 24 hours, which is amazing. And then you watch the sunrise, which is, because of the way Tel Aviv is oriented, pretty. The sunset is gorgeous, but the sunrise is very pretty right there on the beach. And then I said, hey, I want to write this book. This book is a noir, right? So I think that's an important part of what this book is. So
yeah, so I wanted to ask you, it kind of sticks out from the regular literature of American, American literature in Israel that happens. So it's very, very unique in that sense.
Yes.
Can you tell us how did you choose that, and how did you do that?
Happily, and thank you. That's a great question. So the book is noir. I love noir. I happen to believe that noir is one of the, I would say, you may have a different view. I have a view that noir is one of the 3 great, authentic, truly American art forms. They are jazz and its progeny, all the way through hip hop, the Western movie, and the noir novel. And noir is about mood. It's about mise en scène. The great practitioners of all of these 3 different art forms are from around the world, but I think they're basically authentically, originally American art forms. And I think they're very legitimate as art forms, including noir, and need to be measured up against any other form. So that's sort of some background. The second background is the literature about Israel and coming from Israel, about Israel from America and coming from Israel, has effectively been, to date, I think this is kind of the thing you're inviting me to say, in three buckets. So the first two buckets are both Israel as a miraculous place, and of course it is, and I think we should agree that it is. There's a history of writing about Israel from biblical times, meaning the setting is a biblical story, a retelling of a story that is biblical in nature, and there are many such stories which are terrific. The retelling of the Solomon story from Saul's point of view, for example, or Anita Diamant, the Red Tent, that kind of tradition of stories. Something that took place in the Bible times that we're now understanding through a contemporary lens. That's one bucket. The second bucket is the miraculous story of Israel's miraculous founding and heroic moment, right? So from, let's say, 48 to maybe 67, when Israel was accomplishing impossible things every week and every year, day in, day out, year in, year out, Israel was accomplishing impossible things. And there was a heroic moment, a miraculous moment of Israel's founding. And since sort of that moment, 67, maybe in the 70s, the third bucket has emerged, which is mostly, and by the way, so the first buckets are Leon Uris, James Michener, right, Herman Wouk, right? And then since then, you've mostly seen the growth of a more native Israeli literature, which, by the way, looks a lot like the American and European literature of the last 40, 50 years, which is problems of family, intimate problems of relationship, intimate problems of substance abuse and divorce and marriage and so forth, in the sort of very American 20th century style story. And then there's sometimes layered in history of conflict, Palestinian-Jewish conflict, Arab-Jewish conflict, and so forth. But basically, it's a story of the narrative of the family. And what I think is missing is a new literature, which I'm hoping this will be part of. And I see the green shoots of this new literature, which is a literature that considers Israel to be a special and real place where real things happen. And something that also, a literature that also necessarily takes place in Israel, right? There's nothing about a beautiful family story, however well written, usually that has to take place in Tel Aviv or in Haifa versus Berlin or Johannesburg, right? Or Lagos, right? So I believe it's an opportunity for Americans and Israelis to start writing about Israel in an authentic new way, about Israel in a way that is necessarily tied to Israel. So Noir, I think, is a great way into that objective. Why? Noir is so much about atmosphere. Noir is so much about mood. And Noir depends on a few different cross currents in order to be really good. It depends on political intrigue. Well, you got that in Tel Aviv and Israel. It depends on ethnic and socio-political and economic conflict and disarray. You have the rich and the poor. You have the ugly and the beautiful. You have the glamorous and the decidedly unglamorous, sordid, which all live in great mixture and admixture, for example, in Tel Aviv. The great example of Noir always has been Los Angeles and continues to be. But where else do you find that feeling these days? Maybe Miami, maybe probably not New York right now, probably not Berlin anymore, maybe Cape Town, I don't know. But certainly, in my opinion, in Tel Aviv. Yeah. And so I think that one of the key aspirations of this book, as an act of Zionism and as an act of literature, is to revive and evolve the traditions of literature about Israel and literature that takes place in Israel, and bring it to the moment of today when the story is very important, when the contract with the reader, you're going to get a story, it's going to have a mystery, it's going to have a complication, it's going to have a resolution. The contract is honored. The place is a character. Yeah. The place itself is a character and is vivid in its depiction and its presence, and it's essential to the story. And I think that Noir is a terrific way into it. So that was one of the ambitions of this book. Yeah, very ambitious. And I could say, again, I read it. You couldn't leave the book, as so to speak, and you really get the sense of it. But it's interesting because you connected the Israeli atmosphere and the noir, and I'm still wondering, like, what did the your connection to Israel, which you can really, it's easy to see how you're invested in it emotionally. Right. Like you can see the streets, the smells, the character. It's all there. It's like you are sitting. You're basically it's kind of a memoir even
or a
Well,
memoir.
It's certainly a love poem to Israel. This book is
Yeah,
a love,
exactly.
love
It's a
poem
lot of
to
it
Tel Aviv.
is a love poem.
It's in a lot of ways the book is a love poem to Tel Aviv. We're not supposed to read a lot in this format, but I'll read just about 10 lines to give a sense of it, because as you read this book, and as many of you in this audience probably will have been to Israel, will have spent time in Israel and Tel Aviv, you'll recognize this. So this is the beginning of chapter 5. Oscar, who's our hero. Oscar stepped outside the shul and sniffed the sycamore tree above his head. It was mixed with the city sense of a Tel Aviv September. Diesel, heat, sand, moisture from human and atmospheric sweat, sea salt, the notional beginning of rotting leaves, somewhere a cigarette, somewhere a trash bag, stray cats, and evening blooming flowers. And if you've been to Tel Aviv, you know that's it, right? In September. The men brushed past him down the 3 steps to Yavne Street at the bottom of Nachmani. It was 6:30 p.m., and the idea of dusk was arriving in the light that reflected off the white Bauhaus buildings across the quiet 2-lane road. 3 blocks away was Rothschild Boulevard, and the bustling celebratory launch of another bustling celebratory Saturday evening in the most fervent nightlife in the Middle East. But here, it was a small town with a single car passing, and then only the noises of men leaving prayer. Tel Aviv was like that. Move a few hundred meters, and you could find a different tempo and maybe a different century, right? So yeah, that is peppered throughout the book. That sense of place, right? That cannot happen, and this book could not have happened anywhere else. And so I think that's part of that's part of the delight of reading, and has been part of the delight of reading for millennia, right? You want to be somewhere else, and you want to be somewhere else either or or don't know, or can remember or be reminded of, and you want the page to create that synesthesia. You want to smell it. You want to taste it.
While reading the book, as the streets are again my backyard, basically and literally, like I lived there on those streets. It got me a lot more involved emotionally in what happened to the characters and to the plot. And I want to go like another step forward and say the book is kind of a joint place for the discussion, a very explosive one, by the way, in Israel these days, about immigration, immigration of refugees, of work immigrants, and even Israeli Jewish society, which comes from a lot of places. And can you tell maybe a little bit, why did you put yourself in that very dangerous position of going into that explosive kind of?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. It's a provocative question. It's an important question about this book, and also about Israel this time. So first of all, I wanted to write from the perspective of a non-Israeli for a lot of reasons. I wanted to write a book, and I wanted to lens into the story from a perspective of someone who's not Israeli for a lot of reasons. The hero of our book is himself an immigrant refugee. He's a Congolese man named Oscar Orleans, and he's very, very unusual, perhaps unique, sort of in the Israeli story. There are very few refugees of this type. I'll describe in a second in Israel, and very, very, very few who are not from Sudan. So in this sort of imaginary concocted character, he came from Congo as a student refugee, basically 20-ish years ago, and has since made his life in Israel, speaks Hebrew. And because he was a very early African refugee, he accidentally, on purpose, also because he speaks Hebrew, has become the unofficial liaison for the African refugee population in Israel to the police and the social services. And he's sort of an advocate for them. And the other two major characters of the story, the second and third wheels of the legs of the Tel Aviv trio, are Kobi Sembinski, who is the chief of the asylum police unit for the Israeli police, and then Angelika, his sidekick, the junior officer who is very, very smart but not very brave. So they're all, in some ways, all the characters here, as many do in Israel, have a kind of immigrant quality, but certainly Oscar is the outsider now in Israel, and we see the story through his eyes, chiefly through his eyes. We follow the story chiefly through his eyes. So one thing I did not want to do in this book, and I think there are marvelous books to be written, and many have been written, is focus on the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Jewish-Palestinian conflict. I wanted instead to talk about something that was a different way into the context of Israel, at least in this book, in this in this book that I wrote called Hipset. And one of the things that is sort of truly remarkable of the last about 10 years, 15 years of Israeli history is the Sudanese refugee population and their story. So let's talk about it. So the audience here may or may not be familiar, but there have been up to, I think, about 1,500 now, down to about 900 refugees from the Sudan who have found their way to Israel. And Sudan, as you probably know, the conflict is sort of roughly Muslims to the north, roughly Christians to the south, though there are great exceptions to that rule, and sort of more sort of Arab-looking people-ish to the north, and more sort of sub-Saharan African-looking people to the south of Sudan. Broad strokes, not really totally accurate or fair, but broad strokes. So there's a kind of ethnographic, ethno-conflict, as well as religious conflict in the North and South Sudan. And one of the populations that was most displaced was this Christian sub-Saharan African population that was displaced during these years of conflict. And one of the things that changed in Israel, this is so important as we layer on this understanding, is that until about 15 years ago, Israel was a remarkably poor place relative to even its neighbors, relative to Europe, and so forth. And then the tech revolution, starting 20-ish years ago, suddenly created enormous wealth in Israel that was newfound and different and category changing. And the GDP per capita, the wealth per person, the economic opportunity, the skyscrapers going up, all of these things radically change in Israel very, very rapidly, and they continue to. And as you are all probably familiar, all the time there's more and more economic advancement of this type, broadly speaking, in Israel. So suddenly, for the first time, Israel became a place that an economic political refugee who wasn't Jewish, and perhaps not Arab or Palestinian, would want to go. Mm-hmm. And so think about that, right? So Israel was founded in 48, and for decades before, a long time before, as a place that Jews wanted to be. And there are many narratives where Palestinians or Israeli Arabs or Arabs would want to be. And then there was a whole story of displaced people and so forth in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and ongoing. So what happened? Nobody expected at the time that anyone who was, let's say, not Jewish would want to come to Israel. And of course, there's always the exceptional sort of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian person looking for a summer kick at a kibbutz. But that's a different thing, right? That's a different thing. So what's so important about this, as I researched this, is that Israel had law to handle Ashkenazic, Mizrahi, Sephardi, displaced persons, refugees, post-Shoah, and so forth. Israel developed law to handle Ethiopian immigrants. Israel had law to handle, and well or not, that's a fair question for debate, but well or not, Israeli Arabs, Christian Arabs, Palestinians, displaced or not. Israel did not have law, did not have legal technology to handle economic refugees who are not Jewish or Palestinian, because it just didn't come up. And no one imagined it would ever come up. So when this trickle of Sudanese refugees 15, 20 years ago, escaping hardship, showed up in a new country that was far wealthier than it had ever been before, to look for political and social and economic and religious asylum, there was no way to process them. There was no way to cognize them legally. So Israel, which is, of course, has a great bureaucracy, as many countries do, was suddenly stuck with this population and had this ethical dilemma, which is, how can we, as a country, defined in many ways by a population that is displaced, that is religious in its refugee orientation, that is political and desperate in its refugee orientation from our immigrant population? How can we reject this desperate population from Sudan? At the same time, what do we do with them? They're not Jews. There's no legal technology and so forth. So this population stayed in limbo. And if you go around, and is still largely in limbo today, and if you go around certain parts of effectively South Tel Aviv in particular, you'll see suddenly going around a corner several blocks of a population that looks straight out of Africa, like a completely different looking population. And it's very, very, very hard to tell what's going to happen to them. Now, the constraints and the political pressures have been enormous. You have former Holocaust survivors who are loudly calling for them to be protected, or loudly saying, we don't want this population in our neighborhood. This is a Jewish state. And it's sort of hard to dismiss either point of view on an emotional level or on an ethical level on some level. So it's been a political football. It's a very small population, but a very visible population. So anyway, our story takes place in this population. Why? The story begins on Shabbat morning when our hero, Oscar, who's Congolese, remember, gets a phone call, very unusual for him, to get a phone call on Shabbat morning from Kobe. And a dead body has shown up in the dolphinarium. You remember the dolphinarium. It's now been torn down, this eyesore, but there's a picture for the Hamavin Yavin population among us. Those who know will know this is the dolphinarium, this decrepit, horrible place itself with enormously important Tel Aviv conflict and Israeli conflict history. Of course, this very sad story of the bombing 20 so years ago.
A real monument. It's kind of a monument for that.
A monument for that. And the body of this young person is found, shot through and killed. And it is revealed that this person was from a tribe, an important tribe in Sudan, South Sudan, called the Toposa, who are themselves noteworthy for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons they're noteworthy is they've never converted, and they've never allowed themselves to be converted to either Islam or Christianity. So they remain an animist tribe and a very important population. And they're an ancient tribe with ancient knowledge. And he's a member, although they can't identify who he is, he's a member of this tribe, and he's identifiable through the markings on his body as a member of the Toposa. And he shows up, and Oscar is tasked immediately with finding out who he is, what he was doing in Israel, how he got there, and why was he killed. And answering this mystery is the piston, the engine that gives motion and animation to this journey through Israel, this journey through Tel Aviv, and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like putting all those layers together, the Noir, the Israel layer, and the immigrant layer has done so much to the story, and the story really drives it forward. And I see that we have already questions from the audience, and to say, I love it when the audience has the questions I have as well. So Cheryl asked, did you observe all of this background information, or did you do research? Because it really seems like you have a lot of knowledge about that, and you're really kind of in depth in that immigration and refugee kind of issue in Israel.
Well, a lot of research, to be sure, and like anything else, a lot of personal experience that's been translated into novel form. So all of the characters are based on people I've observed, or have elements of people I've observed, or perhaps of myself or other people in my life. And of course, the tapestry of Tel Aviv itself is all through personal experience and sort of meter by meter personal experience through the streets of Tel Aviv. I think part of for millennia, part of the essential agreement between writer and reader was that the reader would receive something true, would get access to something true with perspective about a place that on some level does exist, and a story that takes place only in that could take place only in that location. So even if the story takes place in London, or if it takes place on the moon, it's a story that takes place in a place that could exist or does exist, that is relatable. This place does exist, Tel Aviv. And by the way, it's not a derivative form of Tel Aviv. This is Tel Aviv, Mamash Tel Aviv, that we're describing here. And the characters are very much characters you see running around the streets. The Ukrainian police officer, the Sabra police officer with German roots, the Central Eurasian morgue technician who is sort of trying to hide her accent, the corners of Tel Aviv, the sense. These are all the Sudanese themselves, right? The Sudanese populate in my book. They sort of center their lives around a Jawa cafe, which is basically a coffee cafe that I've invented, but that looks and feels a lot like ones that can and do exist in such places. And so the habits, the furniture, all these things are very, very real. And then by the way, there's of course a lot of research. You have to research in order to really understand the Toposa, and there's not a lot of written information about Toposa available. And one thing that you'll probably be aware of is there's a biblical backstory to this book. The Queen of Sheba, and we can get to that later if you want. The Queen of Sheba and her relationship, her love affair with Solomon, becomes an extremely important piece of prehistory that is found in the book, and of course that is only accessible through reading and research. But you want to give as much life to that as possible. It's interesting. Only in the last 100 years since Joyce and so forth did we basically agree as readers to not require a story, right? Or in the case of Joyce, even a sentence. And then we went through the American versions of this with John Updike and so forth, where kind of like the detailed look at the countertop made of Formica, which has a crack that looks a lot like the fissure in your wet marriage, and has a stain from coffee that looks a lot like the drug episode that your teenage son had, right? Only recently did we allow that to substitute for actual storytelling. And by the way, I like that stuff too. In fact, I've written those shadows and light things too. I think they belong in literary journals and short stories. But I believe in the last 20 years, a lot of writers have just said, enough is enough. And a lot of readers have said, enough is enough. We want a story. We want the story back, guys. We want the story back, guys. And so there is no violation of the literary aspiration to have a story, right? Imagine all of the great books of time from before 1920 without a story. They couldn't exist. There's no such thing. So we're bringing the story back, and we're putting it in Israel, and we're treating Israel like a real place.
And which is amazing. And still you started to say there is one chapter, without doing a spoiler, of course, but which is different, and which takes, as you said, takes like a historical a moment and kind of takes your story to another level, kind of another sphere, maybe. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the choice that you did to put that in?
Yeah. So one of the chapters that seems to get most attention from the readers. Thank God this book has been very well received, and it's interesting. The things that you think as a writer people are going to pick up on are sometimes right and sometimes just like, I didn't know they'd pick up on this versus that. And by the way, just to let you in, many of you will be writers themselves, but sometimes you're like, oh, gee, I wish they noticed this one thing I thought was so great a little bit more. And sometimes they don't. They're like, look, we got our own ideas. But then, thank God, on the other side of the coin, there are sometimes things that they say, wow, this special part of the book really stood out to me. And one of the things that really stands out to readers about this book, I've been delighted to see, is one chapter in particular, which is a chapter that's told in a different register, a different voice. So the book is basically told through the point of view of Oscar Orleans. We see the world through his lens. It's a third-person narrative. It's not first person, it's third-person narrative. But we see that we travel the story through his book, through his eyes. Now, at one point, an important character who is a leader of the Sudanese population, a self-appointed pastor, and he's a leader of the Sudanese population. It is demanded of him. He is asked to explain what the heck happened. What the hell happened back then out there in the desert? What was going on out there in the desert? What? Damn it! Tell us what happened. I'm summarizing. And he says, okay, I have to tell you a story. And then the next chapter is his story. And those of you who've read Jewish literature from the centuries or other literature will recognize this move, this beautiful move that so many authors have used over time. It's not mine, but I've deployed the move, which is the chapter begins and it is told in a different voice and register. And it is told as a parable. And it is told in the voice and decibel and tone of a parable. And the parable is the parable of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, and their historic and beatific and troubling successful and ultimately tragic, in some ways, unsuccessful ending love affair. And also, by the way, the meaning of the book, Hipset, is finally revealed about 2/3, 3/4 of the way of the book through this parable. And by the way, just a word to the wise, the Hipset phrase, you get 2 head fakes. I give you 2 head fakes in the first chapter or 2 about what the phrase Hipset means. Even the first couple of pages, I give you the first head fake. Oh, I know what Hipset now means. In fact, you don't really know what Hipset refers to until you get to this chapter. And all of that makes sense and falls into place. And it's because of this torrid and important love affair between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Do we have some lies, some mysteries, and some treasures that remain unsolved, unfound, and ununderstood until today? And the journey from Sudan to Israel is in some ways a completion of a journey that began thousands of years ago in this important historic biblical moment. So it is a parable, and it's so interesting to see in the middle of this sort of noir book a parable, and also interesting to see the readers just say, wow, that's the part, bang, changing the register, totally unexpected. Then the voice goes back in the next chapter. And so I'm delighted to see that's arresting readers and giving them pleasure.
I think it's also because it in some way it seems like you are giving a resolution there of the immigrant and the refugee situation. It's some sort of intertwines, kind of connects them to us, Judaism to the refugee. I don't know. It's some sort, gives us like a biblical background of our connection, which means it seems like you have a message there. And my next question is, what kind of message do you have for the readers in that sense? Like, what would you understand the question?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a very fair question. First of all, you write a book. Look, I think the Jewish readers are very important for me for a lot of reasons. But also, I hope to write a book that non-Jewish readers can be interested in, non-Zionists can be interested in. And it has to, first of all, stand up as a book. It has to deliver the promise of a book. It's a story, characters you like, relate to, characters who are believable, credible, characters who are authentic, who make sense, and so forth, and characters you want to read more of, right? So the phrase Tel Aviv Trio, which is used to describe Oscar, Kobe, and Angelica, is not mine. It came from some early readers who started reviewing the book, and they called them the Tel Aviv Trio, and they said, "Are you going to have sequels from the Tel Aviv Trio?" Which I hope so. I hope to hell this is a great successful story, and I can continue their journey. But then I also want it to be a book that the Zionists, the people who are interested in Israel, the people who are Jewish advocates of Israel, non-Jewish advocates of Israel, also say, hey, look, I like where this is going. It does not have to depict Israel as a heroic place in every moment. It is enough to describe Israel as a real place of this moment, an honest place with good things and bad things and tough things. And one of the things I think you're asking about, Yiftah, is a key question. What is Israel? And Israel is nothing if not a place of immigration and of blending, right? And some of the immigration and blending comes with great hardship and heartache. If you're Jewish or if you're not Jewish, if you're Israeli or if you're not Israeli, if you're just a person of ethics, and some of it comes with great pride. I mean, just today, this morning, we are seeing the arrival in Israel of another 100 Ethiopians greeted at the airport by the prime minister and the government, and described as one of the great, moments of pure Zionism that's happening. This is a story that's still unfolding. It's still unfolding, not just because of the Sabras, but of course, yes, but also because in some ways, as we are in America, but even more so in Israel, more recently, we are all, the population is very much an immigrant population. And it's sort of on some level hard to distinguish one immigrant from another immigrant. And so, yes, I do think that this story is inextricably linked. However, the other message to answer your question directly is one I've been teasing so far already a few times in this talk, which is to say that Israel is a real place and should be treated as such. It does not have to be held up every day, although it can be held up every day, some part, but does not have to be held up every day as a place where only magic happens or only, God forbid, bad things happen. Both of those are inaccurate and, by the way, I think disserving characterizations of Israel. It does not only have to be the place of the greatest spies in the world and of miracle upon miracle. It's a place where real things happen. And in that reality lies great beauty and opportunity. And by the way, Tel Aviv is a unique place. Israel's a unique place, a place of political intrigue, of ethno-religious mixed conflict, good, bad, of great economic disparity that's increasing, of vested interests, of, even in this tiny country, I mean, gee, the north and the south, the east and the west, right? Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So it's in that admixture, right? I mean, you can't really do this in Switzerland, right? Just imagine Switzerland. It's like, oh, that part's French and that part's Italian and that part's German and they make cuckoo clocks. You know, I'm making a joke, but like there's not that level of kind of like urgency and background atmosphere that gives rise to gorgeous conflict and significant conflict in a place like Switzerland. And so Israel has to be viewed in that way in this post-heroic moment and chapter of Israel, which makes it more real. Compare it to the 67, right? Compare it to the 40s, right? So in the 40s, Israel is being founded. We are turning the desert into vegetation, making the desert bloom. It doesn't really sound the same to say, look, there's another skyscraper on the Tayelet. Wow, like it's not the same feeling, but a different feeling happens. Israel is now a fact. It's here to stay. It's got great promise. And then the underbelly is where the action now happens for literature.
So I wanna read on that note a question from the audience, and don't worry, I'm not skipping. Well, I'm skipping them a little bit, but I'm gonna come back to the other questions just because it's relevant. So, did you run your dialogue and character past someone from the same background and culture to be sure that it passed the smell test with them? It would seem you would run the risk of stereotyping-ish.
Great. So I choose to consider the question not a woke question, which I would have little time for, but instead a serious literary question. Yes, of course. So there's a lot of consultation here. There's a lot of dialogue that's spoken by Israelis, by Africans of different origins or different sort of birthplaces, by Israelis of different backgrounds, Sabra, some with different ethno-religious origins, Central Europe, Central Asia, Ukraine, and so forth. Some of it you have to trust your own ear and do a lot of interviews to make it work. And some of it you have to do some smell tests, very practical question. But look, I mean, there are a lot of people in this audience who are going to love Philip Roth, for example. And I always felt like Philip Roth got kind of the New York Jewish Register and the New York Jewish voice a little bit wrong, but a lot of people think it's tone perfect. But more broadly, let me broaden the question. Broadening the question: how do you know that you're getting it right? How do you know that you're getting it right? And you think when you get a question like this, which is certainly fair, you think of the challenge that Hollywood has when it translates a comic book to the screen, because there are always the diehard fans who are like, oh my God, the Green Lantern did not wear that pair of shoes at this part of his timeline. Like, that's totally inauthentic. And I boycott the movie, right? Which in some ways is a silly kind of challenge. On some level, it's just a movie and it needs to have its own rules. But there's always a need to balance the authenticity, especially if you hold the book out to be an authentic book, right? This is not a pseudo version of Israel. It's not Israel Prime. It's Israel, it's Tel Aviv, Israel. So you do want it to be, feeling real. And I had to go through some reality testing. And by the way, there's also kind of some baddies, some bad guys, gangsters and cops and so forth. So you want it to sound like a cop. You want it to sound like a gangster. You want it to sound like a person who's not just from a certain ethno-religious background, but a certain kind of flavor of profession and upbringing as well. Education. You have an archaeologist in the book, right? A very educated archaeologist professor in the book who speaks in a different voice that she does. So yeah, look, I of course you have to do a lot of research and make it feel feel real. And that's part of the contract with the reader.
Yeah, and again, I'm the weird guy here because I'm the Israeli reading it right now, and just I can say it's very bold of you to try and articulate it, but you did it like in a really great manner, just to put on the surface all the different like you say stereotypes, but really the thing, the Russians, the Ukrainian, the Sudanese, Israelis, the Poland, whatever, and try to bring everyone in kind of in a very authentic way. And I think I loved it as an Israeli. I thought it was very.
And I think you'll see if you read it. I think you'll agree. There is not a single stereotype in this book. All the stereotypes that you could imagine, that you're invited to imagine in the first sentence or two of meeting someone, are fully exploded by page 3 or paragraph 20 on that character as that character develops. It's just, it is very, very important to me, just on every level, to run right at that problem and tackle it right at that problem. So anyway, look, I'm thrilled to bits, and there aren't a lot of places where you can take on that challenge, where the weight, the baggage of history is also on your shoulders, right? It's not quite the same in Toronto, in my opinion. It's like, oh, you have people from Thailand in Toronto. Like, I don't think it like really has as much impact. Maybe I'm wrong about the Thai population of Toronto in particular. Excuse me if I am. But the Sudanese population in Tel Aviv, the Mizrahi Ashkenazic thing that happens in Tel Aviv, that's a thing, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, the distinction between the Florentine and Neve Tzedek and North Tel Aviv, the Old North, those are all real places. May we answer? We're getting some great questions in the comments. Maybe answer a couple of them.
Yeah, we'll continue with that. So Carol asked 2 questions. First of all, has your book been translated to Hebrew? That's like I think a wishful thinking kind of question.
Yeah. Well, I hope it will be. It has not yet been. I've got a lot of Israeli friends who have read it in English, and now it's been reviewed by a lot of the Israeli blog English-speaking blog population, and periodicals are now beginning to review it. And thank God for very good notices. And by the way, they're Americans, but they're also Sabras, Israelis, Europeans, Israelis. And by the way, some of the you'll see Raphael Jurosalmi, who's this terrific French-Israeli writer I admire very much, has given a beautiful endorsement of our new edition that's coming out right now. And Faye Kellerman, the great American Jewish detective writer, has written a beautiful endorsement of the book as well. People who know Israel very well, live in Israel. I have not yet translated into Hebrew, and I hope to. I've not yet translated into Hebrew because I need to find really a good, subtle translator. Translation is exceptionally difficult, and when it's done exceptionally well. When it's not done well, it just makes the book lousy, right? And as one of the questions put earlier, you have to make sure that all of this work you've done to get all the different voices and all the different tones just right, translatable as well. And so I'm sure there are great translators. I just haven't yet found one, and I know there's demand to have it in Hebrew. And I'd be so proud to have this done in Hebrew. Look, I as a personal reflection, I'm noticing just here. Look, if you go here, I have 2 books. One, Hipset, and then here's the Tractate Bava Metzia. So I'm on the daf, 5 or 6 days a week studying, and to read or see my book in Hebrew would be a dream, and to be able to share it with people who are more comfortable in Hebrew than in English would be a dream. But not yet is it done, and I hope if you have a recommendation for a superb translator, I'd welcome it, to be sure.
Well, and you have a couple of questions asking about the future. So first of all, when's your next book published? And if you're going to keep writing about Israel as a base of your writing, that's kind of the 2 questions we have.
Yeah, so I hope, I guess I allowed myself to hope, but I did not really give myself permission to articulate that hope to myself, even, that this could be the beginning of a series, or the beginning of a series of stories. It's written that way, in the sense that we've just met these 3 characters. We've just started Oscar, Kobe, and Angelica, and we've met a cast behind them that's deep. And we've created a universe. We've created a little universe here of people we can care about. And one of the great advantages of noir or of crime as a subject matter is that there's always another crime. And these characters go on a story. And I think that more than anything else, it's like every other book of every type, the readers want more of these characters, right? And I do too. But it wasn't until I started getting the early notices of readers, and not your family. You don't really quite trust your friends and family the same way. Once it kind of went out in the wild and people started saying, "Wow, this and that," and they start to relate to this and that part of the story. And the way the book was launched, by the way, was launched first in the UK by accident of our publication history. And the first, I'd say, several hundred readers were probably, based on their comments, not Jews and certainly not familiar with Israel. Meaning they encountered the book, they said, "Oh, what an interesting story about Israel. I've never been there. What an interesting dive into some Jewish history." In other words, they were certainly not expressing in their comments familiarity or intimacy with Israel or Judaism that you might expect from someone or a population that was more heavily Jewish, for example. And so I was struck and delighted to say, "Hey, we want more of this character." To hear these people say, "We want more of this Tel Aviv trio," their phrase, this character set that we have encountered. So I do hope to move on with these three. And also, yes, I do hope to put these three again in Tel Aviv where they live and in Israel where they live. I don't know if it'll be the Sudanese population next time, but certainly, something like that could be very important, and maybe we'll track some of the characters we met along the way. I'm also working on a story or a book, I don't know yet, that is in a different theme that takes place. The major action takes place in Brooklyn. And I hope I finish the story, but I'll just describe it now because we're in that mood. That takes place in Brooklyn during the Crown Heights riots. And our story is located sort of on the corners, on the margins of that moment, with the background being this extremely tense moment in the Crown Heights riots. And because it's a story that also involves Haredi, Hasidim, it's a story that necessarily has echoes in Eastern Europe and in Israel and moments there. I notice that you have an extremely astute and superb and generous member of your audience who identifies herself. So I'll name her as Debbie Landau, who says that I'm a wonderful speaker. And I thank you very much, Debbie. And I hope to be able to communicate with you and your audience over and over again. It's so generous. I'll tell you something. You all know this, but just to reinforce it, it is so precious for someone who has done something hard, as so many of the people in the audience have done in their lives too. And you'll know this for that reason. It's so precious when you've done something hard, as writing a book is. It's hard. And it's sort of thankless for a long time. It's so precious to receive a comment from someone you don't know. And I've never met Ms. Landau, Dr. Landau. I've never met Debbie Landau. It's so precious to receive a compliment of that kind, because that affirmation, which some people may feel and don't vocalize, when you vocalize it, when you receive it, is just go juice for the next one. And so I want to say thank you very much for that. Every time we get an email unsolicited, I get a jolt. And by the way, that's why I am in the business probably once or twice a week of finding an author I've read and admired and sending him or her a comment saying, "This is what I loved about your book," because I know how impactful it is, right? We don't do this for the money, right? It's really a mistake to write a novel for the money. It really is. Even though this book is more commercial than my prior work in a lot of ways, it's really a mistake to write something like this for the money. But we do hope that people love it, and we do hope that people read it. And so thank you very much for that generous comment.
I have to tell you, I wrote a letter once to an author, but he didn't reply. But whatever.
Oh, I'm ashamed to hear that. I always reply to my fans, always. And so many of the authors I read and admire do, because I think they understand. They understand it. And by the way, it's so easy. In just as an author, I can tell you, it's so easy to develop a personal relationship with an author of an article you admired, of a book you admired, because you think that they get all these compliments, all this kind of feedback and professional acclaim. And the truth is, you might never hear from someone, and occasionally hear from someone a week or a month later after you publish something, and you say, "Wow, thank you," and they often respond.
Yeah.
And so I encourage you to do that, whether it's with me or with someone else you admire or someone you whose work you do. I think you'll find you often get into a very interesting correspondence. I have, and it's been a great pleasure as a reader.
And it seems you have a lot of followers and fans also here, and you're getting all from the beginning. You have a lot of very good comments and giving comments. There's one question. I'm just because I'm Israeli and I'm not sure I got it, so I'm going to read it. And if it's has it been optioned yet? Steve,
oh, has it been optioned yet? Oh, what a generous question.
I'm sorry. Can you explain the question to me?
So that's a question that means, has someone from Hollywood paid for the cinematic rights or theatrical rights or something like that? The answer is no. I've been cautious so far with that. I do. There are enough kind of overlays of cinema here that and TV series here that a number of people from Israel and Hollywood have expressed interest in a TV show or some sort of movie possibly, and I'm delighted by the possibility. It is, I think what I've learned about that in my years is that you have to really make sure you partner with someone who's serious, passionate, and resourceful. And I am still figuring out how to identify quality in that area, but I do welcome it. So because we're a public YouTube thing, and this is going to live on forever, as I understand it, and I hope that's for the better. I'll answer this one question from one questioner who says, "What's the best way to contact the author if you can't find them on Facebook or at a university email?" So I'd rather not give out my personal email on a public YouTube, if that's okay. But you can find me on Twitter at Michael Fertik, and you can also find my website, which is my last name.com, fertik.com, which is where you'll find works of art and writing and so forth, and you can contact me through there. Or if you're inclined, I will be very receptive and very responsive to the extent that I can to anyone who contacts me through the Detroit JCC process, and that's also certainly. But I believe in being responsive. I believe in taking great care of those precious people who take great care of authors, and so I'll do my best to be responsive personally, while still also handling all the things you have to handle in life. But I will. I promise to do my best.
Great. So you can see the comments, and I want to wrap it up by saying thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for this conversation. Very interesting for me, and thank you for writing this book. Taking us on a journey inside Israel, inside the streets, inside the smells, with a real story, as you said, a real story there, in the real Israel, and still going on very deep levels of the Israeli society and history as well. So thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, Yiftah. Thank you to Brenda Brook. Thank you to Jamie Loeb and the team from the Detroit Book Fair. And thank you also to this terrific and engaged audience for your challenging questions, your great comments and questions, compliments, queries, and encouragements. It means an enormous lot to me, and I want to say thank you.
And thank you, Michael and Yiftah, for being with us today and for such an informative, riveting conversation. And thanks to all of you at home for joining us. Our next event is today at 1:30 when Dan Perez talks about his book, As Needed for Pain, a memoir of addiction. And remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair for our full schedule and a link to buy Michael's book and ways to get involved. Stay safe and have a great day.